"Hey, Hunter, will you be my papa?" she asked, her tiny voice cracking through the canyon silence like a gunshot through glass. And the giant Navajo, this mountain of a man who had sworn never to feel again, knelt beside her in the wilderness, his weathered hands trembling as tears carved rivers down his dust-covered face. New Mexico Territory, late autumn 1881, where the high desert met the pine forests, and the wind carried secrets older than memory. The Sangre de Cristo Mountains stood like jagged teeth against a blood-orange sky, their peaks dusted with the first snow of the season, and below them stretched a land of red rock canyons, twisted juniper trees, and vast emptiness that swallowed sound whole. This was a country that did not forgive weakness, did not shelter the careless, and did not ask questions about a man's past. It simply let you exist if you were strong enough, quiet enough, and willing to face the loneliness that came with freedom. To Nighthawk was all three. He rode through the canyon bottoms like a shadow-given form, a man so large that his silhouette against the sunset looked like something carved from the mountains themselves. 6 feet and 7 inches of solid muscle, broad shoulders that had carried wounded men through battlefields, hands that could snap a rifle stock or cradle a bird's egg with equal ease. His hair, black as obsidian and streaked with silver, hung long past his shoulders, tied back with a strip of leather that had seen better decades. His face was all hard angles and deep lines, a roadmap of pain written in bronze skin, weathered by sun and wind and years of refusing to hide from either. Across his left cheekbone ran a scar, pale and raised, shaped like a lightning bolt. A gift from a cavalry saber during a raid he barely survived. He wore the clothes of a tracker and hunter, buckskin shirt decorated with traditional Navajo beadwork his grandmother had sewn before the long walk, before the soldiers came, before everything changed. Dark trousers tucked into worn boots that had walked thousands of miles. A wide-brimmed hat, black and battered, shaded eyes so dark they looked like pieces of the night sky. On his hip hung a Colt revolver, well-maintained but rarely drawn, and across his back, a Winchester rifle and a traditional Navajo bow. Because some skills were older than gunpowder and just as deadly, the buckskin gelding beneath him moved with the careful respect animals showed to men who understood silence. Toe had raised this horse from a foal, gentled it with patience instead of breaking it with force. The animal trusted him completely, which made it one of 3 living things in the territory that did. The other 2 were a golden eagle that sometimes followed him on long rides, and an old medicine man named Hosteen Yazi, who lived in the mesas and spoke less than Toe did. Toe followed no trail today, just instinct and the pull of something he could not name. He had woken before dawn with a feeling in his chest, a tightness, a knowing. His grandmother would have called it a message from the spirits. His mother would have said the wind was speaking. Toe just called it survival sense, the same thing that had kept him alive through ambushes and betrayals, and nights when death sat so close he could feel its cold breath on his neck. The canyon walls rose steep on either side, red and orange stone, layered like the pages of an ancient book. Petroglyphs marked some surfaces, handprints and spirals left by the ancestors, stories told in stone. The air smelled of sage and dust and the distant promise of rain. Above, hawks circled lazy arcs against the deepening blue, and somewhere far off, a coyote sang a question to the coming night. That is when he heard it, a sound so faint it almost vanished beneath the wind's whisper. A small, broken sob, human, young, afraid, Toe reined in hard, his gelding stopping instantly. He sat perfectly still, head tilted, every sense focused. There it was again, crying, muffled, coming from somewhere ahead and below. His heart, which had beaten the same steady rhythm for years, suddenly kicked harder. He dismounted in one smooth motion, boots hitting the red dirt without sound, and moved forward on foot, following the noise with the precision of a man who had tracked wounded prey through worse terrain. The canyon floor sloped downward, narrowing into a crevice where winter runoff had carved deep grooves in the rock. Brush and scrub oak clung to the edges, and just beyond them, hidden behind a cluster of boulders, He found the source, a mine shaft. Old, abandoned, the kind left behind by prospectors who had chased silver dreams into the earth and found only darkness. The wooden supports had rotted, the entrance half collapsed, and someone had tried to cover it with branches and stones, a weak attempt at safety that time and weather had undone. And somewhere down in that black throat of earth, a child was crying. Toe approached the edge, dropped to one knee, and peered into the shaft. The light from above reached only so far before surrendering to shadow. But in that dim glow, maybe 15 feet down, he saw her, a little girl, no more than 5 or 6 years old. Blonde hair tangled with dirt and cobwebs, dress torn and muddy. She sat on a collapsed beam, legs dangling over empty space, tiny hands gripping the wood so tight her knuckles had gone white. Her face was streaked with tears and dust, and when she looked up and saw the massive silhouette blocking the light above, her crying stopped. Veer replaced it, wide-eyed and breathless. Tu said nothing. He simply stared down at her, his mind already calculating distance, angle, the stability of the shaft walls, the weight of the child, the strength of his rope. He reached back to his saddle, pulled free a coil of braided leather rope, tested it with a sharp tug, then returned to the shaft. The girl watched him, trembling. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. Just a tiny, choked whimper. Tu tied a loop at one end of the rope, the kind that would hold without tightening, and lowered it carefully into the shaft. It swung slightly in the still air, spinning slow, and came to rest just above her head. He looked down at her. His voice, when it finally came, was low, rough, but not unkind. "Put your arms through. Hold tight." The girl stared at the rope, then back up at him. Her lips trembled. She was terrified, not just of the fall, but of him, of this enormous stranger who had appeared out of nowhere, whose face she could barely see, whose voice sounded like stones grinding together. But the beam beneath her creaked, shifted slightly, and that decided it. She reached up, small hands shaking, and slipped her arms through the loop. Toe pulled gently, adjusting the fit, making sure it sat snug under her shoulders and across her back. Then he braced himself, boots planted wide, and began to pull, slow, steady, hand over hand. The girl rose inch by inch, her weight barely a challenge for a man who had once dragged a fully grown elk carcass 3 miles uphill. But this was different. This was fragile. This was precious. His jaw clenched as he focused, ignoring the ache starting in his shoulders, the burn in his palms. The shaft walls were unstable. Loose stones tumbled as the rope scraped against them. One wrong move and the whole thing could collapse. Halfway up, the girl's foot slipped against the wall. She yelped, swung sideways, and for a terrible moment Toe felt the rope jerk in his hands. He tightened his grip instantly, muscles locking, and held her suspended. She dangled there, spinning slightly, sobbing again. He did not speak. He just pulled. Faster now, stronger, until her small head cleared the edge. Then her shoulders, then her whole body. He reached down, grabbed her under the arms with one hand, while holding the rope with the other, and lifted her out. She weighed almost nothing. He set her down on the solid ground beside the shaft and stepped back, giving her space, giving her air. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The girl sat on the dirt, legs folded beneath her, breathing hard. Her dress was shredded at the hem, her knees scraped raw and bleeding. Mud caked her arms and face, and somewhere along the way she had lost a shoe. She coughed, wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, then looked up, and saw him clearly for the first time. Tu Nighthawk stood against the fading light, towering and still, his face half in shadow. The scar on his cheek caught the last rays of sun, making it glow pale against his bronze skin. His long hair moved slightly in the breeze. His hands, massive and scarred, hung loose at his sides. He did not smile, did not kneel, did not reach for her. He just stood there, watching her with eyes that held oceans of sadness and something else she could not name. The girl stared at him for a long time. She took in the size of him, the quiet strength, the way he stood like a mountain that had decided to stay. She saw the beadwork on his shirt, the feathers tied in his hair, the way the land seemed to recognize him as one of its own. And then, in a voice so small it almost broke apart on the way out, she whispered, "Are you an angel?" Dutta blinked. It was the only reaction he gave. Then, after a pause that stretched long enough to hear a hawk cry overhead, he shook his head once. "No." The girl's lip trembled. She looked down at her scraped hands, at the dirt under her fingernails, at the blood on her knees. Then she looked back up at him, and this time something shifted in her expression. Not fear, not quite trust, but maybe the beginning of it. "What's your name?" she asked. Tao hesitated. Most people called him Hunter or Nighthawk or nothing at all. Some of the traders knew his full name. The soldiers who had tried to kill him knew it too. But this child, sitting in the dirt with tears drying on her cheeks, asking with a voice that shook but did not run, deserved an answer. "Two," he said quietly. She tilted her head, testing the sound of it in her mouth. "Toe?" He nodded. "That's pretty," she said. And despite everything, despite the terror and the pain and the exhaustion, she smiled. Just a little, just enough to felt something crack inside his chest. Not break, crack, like ice on a river in spring, the first split before the thaw. He looked away quickly, jaw tight, and cleared his throat. "What's yours?" he asked, though he was not sure he wanted to know, because names made things real, and real things could hurt you. "Meadow," she said softly. "But my mama used to call me Little Meadow, 'cause I was born in one. She said I was the prettiest flower she ever saw." Tu's throat tightened. He glanced back at her. "Where's your mama now?" And the smile disappeared. Meadow looked down at her hands again, and when she spoke her voice was so quiet he almost missed it. "Gone. Daddy too. Everyone's gone." The wind picked up, cold now, carrying the smell of distant rain. Tu looked at this little girl, this child alone in the wilderness, covered in dirt and blood and loss, and he saw himself. He saw the boy he had been when the soldiers came, when his family was marched away, when everything he knew turned to ash and memory. He saw the man he became after the war, after the ambush, after he buried the only people he had left and swore never to care again. But here she was, looking up at him with eyes that had seen too much, asking nothing, expecting nothing, just sitting there like a wildflower growing in the crack of a stone. He moved then, finally kneeling down so he was closer to her level. Up close, she looked even smaller, even more fragile. He reached into the pouch on his belt and pulled out a strip of clean cloth, the kind he used for binding wounds. Without a word, he took her hand, gently wiped the dirt and blood from her scraped palm, then wrapped it carefully. His hands, so large they could have crushed her, moved with a softness that contradicted everything about him. Meadow watched him work, fascinated. "You're really big," she said. "Yes. Are you a giant?" "No, you look like one." Tu finished wrapping her hand and moved to the other one. "I'm just a man. A big man." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Do you live out here?" Sometimes. All by yourself?" Yes. That sounds lonely." Tu paused. His hands stilled. He looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in years he did not have an answer ready, because she was right. It was lonely. He had chosen it, carved it out like a grave he could live in, but it was still lonely. Meadow leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a whisper like she was sharing a secret. "I'm lonely too." And there it was, the truth between them, spoken by a child who did not know how to lie yet. Tu felt that crack in his chest widen, felt something warm and terrifying flood in through the gap. He wanted to stand up, to walk away, to leave her here with the rope and directions to the nearest town. But he could not. His body would not move. His hands stayed gentle on hers, finishing the bandage. When he was done, he sat back on his heels and studied her. "Where were you going?" he asked. Meadow shrugged. "I don't know. I was with a wagon train, but they left me. Said I slowed them down. Said orphans were bad luck." Her voice wavered. "I tried to follow, but I got lost. Then I fell in that hole, and it was dark, and I thought nobody would ever find me." Tu's jaw tightened. Anger cold and sharp flickered through him. What kind of people left a child alone in country like this? What kind of cowards called themselves civilized and then abandoned the most helpless among them? He had seen cruelty before, plenty of it, but this felt different. This felt personal. "How long were you down there?" he asked. "I don't know." "A long time. The sun moved a lot. Hours, then. Maybe half a day." She must have been terrified, must have screamed herself hoarse before she gave up and just cried. Who looked at the shaft, at the darkness waiting below, and felt a cold shiver run through him. If he had not come this way, if he had ignored that feeling in his chest, if he had been even an hour later, she would have died down there. Alone. Forgotten. He stood abruptly, decision made. "Can you ride a horse?" Meadow looked up at him, eyes wide. "I think so. I rode on the wagon sometimes." "Good." He walked to his gelding, untied the reins, and led the animal over. The horse lowered its head, sniffing curiously at the girl. Meadow giggled, a sound so bright and unexpected that Toe almost smiled. Almost, he lifted her easily, set her in the saddle, and swung up behind her. She fit in front of him like she belonged there, small and safe, surrounded by his arms, as he took the reins. The gelding shifted, adjusting to the extra weight, then settled. "Where are we going?" Meadow asked, her voice suddenly lighter, hopeful. Two looked out at the canyon, at the sky turning purple and gold, at the long shadows stretching like fingers across the earth. He thought about the town of Piedra Roja 20 miles south, where people would ask questions he did not want to answer. He thought about the mission school in Santa Fe, where they would take her in and teach her to forget where she came from. He thought about all the places she could go, all the futures she could have. And then he thought about the cabin he had built in the high country, hidden among the pines, where no one came and no one asked, and the only sounds were wind and water and the language of the wild. "Somewhere safe," he said finally. Meadow leaned back against his chest, her small body relaxing for the first time since he found her. "Okay," she whispered. "I trust you." And Toe Nighthawk, the man who had sworn never to feel again, who had buried his heart with his family, who had walked through fire and blood and come out the other side hard as stone, felt that crack in his chest split wide open. He did not speak. He just nudged the gelding forward, and they rode into the gathering dusk, a giant and a little girl, two lost souls who had found each other in the wilderness. The cabin sat at the edge of the world, or at least that is how it felt to anyone who managed to find it. Nestled in a clearing surrounded by towering ponderosa pines, with a creek running cold and clear just 30 yards from the door. It was a place built for solitude. The logs were hand-hewn and fitted tight, chinked with mud and moss. The roof was sod and stone, thick enough to hold heat in winter and stay cool in summer. A stone chimney rose from the center, and beside the door hung bundles of dried herbs, sage and sweetgrass, offerings to the spirits and practical medicine both. Two had built this place 5 years ago, after he could no longer stand the noise of civilization, the questions, the stares, the way people looked at him like he was either a savage or a saint, depending on which story they had heard. Out here, there were no stories, just survival, just silence. Just him, until now. He dismounted in front of the cabin as the last light died behind the mountains. Meadow had fallen asleep against his chest an hour into the ride, her small body going limp with exhaustion, her breathing soft and steady. He lifted her carefully, cradling her in one arm, while he pushed open the door with the other. Inside, the cabin was dark and cold, untouched for 3 days, while he had been out tracking a mountain lion that had been taking cattle from a ranch near the border. He laid Meadow on the narrow bed in the corner, covering her with a thick wool blanket his grandmother had woven before the long walk, before everything changed. The girl did not stir. She was beyond tired, beyond fear, somewhere deep in the kind of sleep that came after trauma. Toe stood over her for a moment, watching the rise and fall of her chest, the way her small hand curled near her cheek. She looked impossibly fragile, lying there like something the wind could carry away. He turned abruptly, moving to the hearth where he built a fire with practiced efficiency. Kindling, then larger sticks, then logs arranged just so. Within minutes, flames licked upward, casting warm light across the rough wooden walls. The cabin began to breathe again, to remember what it felt like to hold life. He filled a pot with water from the bucket by the door and set it to boil, then rummaged through his supplies. Dried meat, cornmeal, a tin of lard, some wild onions he had gathered weeks ago. Not much, but enough. He had learned long ago to live on less than most men needed. He made a simple stew, thick and filling, the kind that warmed you from the inside out. As it simmered, he checked on Meadow again. Still asleep. Good. She needed rest more than food right now. He ate alone, sitting on a stool near the fire, spooning stew into his mouth without tasting it. His mind was elsewhere, circling the problem he had brought into his home. A child, an orphan, a responsibility he had not asked for and did not want. The smart thing would be to take her to Piedra Roja in the morning, hand her over to the church or the sheriff, let someone else deal with it. Someone better suited. Someone who knew how to care for the living instead of just surviving among ghosts. But even as he thought it, he knew he would not do it. Could not. Something in the way she had looked at him, the way she had said, "I trust you," with a voice that should not have had any trust left in it, had hooked into him like a barb. He was caught, trapped, and the worst part was, he was not sure he wanted to escape. He finished his meal, cleaned the pot, and banked the fire so it would burn slow through the night. Then he grabbed a second blanket, spread it on the floor near the hearth, and lay down. Sleep did not come easily. It rarely did. But eventually, somewhere in the hours before dawn, exhaustion won. He woke to the sound of movement. His hand went to the knife on his belt before his eyes even opened, instinct faster than thought. But then he remembered. The girl, Meadow. He sat up slowly, blinking in the grey pre-dawn light filtering through the single window. She was awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, bare feet dangling, staring at him with those wide, serious eyes. "Morning?" she said quietly, as if she was not sure whether speaking was allowed. Toe nodded, standing and stretching. His back ached from sleeping on the floor, but he ignored it. He had slept in worse places. He moved to the hearth, stirred the coals, added wood, and soon had the fire blazing again. He reheated the leftover stew and handed her a bowl without a word. She took it carefully, wrapping her small hands around the warm tin, and ate slowly, deliberately, like someone who had learned not to waste food. While she ate, Toe went outside. The morning air was sharp and cold, smelling of pine and damp earth. The creek sang its endless song, and somewhere high above, an eagle called. He filled the water bucket, checked on his horse, and stood for a moment in the clearing, looking out at the forest that had been his only companion for so long. It felt different now, less empty. He was not sure if that was good or bad. When he came back inside, Meadow had finished eating and was exploring the cabin with the cautious curiosity of a wild animal in a new territory. She touched things lightly, the stone mortar and pestle on the shelf, the bow hanging on the wall, the bundle of feathers tied above the door. She did not take anything, did not disturb anything, just looked. When she noticed him watching, she froze. "Sorry," she said quickly. "I wasn't trying to mess anything up." "You are not," Toe replied. His voice was rough from disuse, but not unkind. "Look all you want." She relaxed slightly. "You have a lot of interesting things." He grunted, not sure how to respond to that. Most of what he owned was either practical or sacred, and he was not used to explaining either. But she was still looking at him, waiting, so he nodded toward the bow. "That was my grandfather's. He taught me to use it when I was younger than you." Her eyes widened. "Really? Can you still use it?" "Yes." "Are you good?" "Good enough." She smiled just a little, and it changed her whole face, made her look less like a ghost and more like a child. "I bet you are really good." "You look like you would be." Toe did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing. Instead, he moved to the trunk in the corner and pulled out a set of clothes. They were old, too small for him now, things he had kept for reasons he could not quite name. A shirt, trousers, socks. They would be too big for Meadow, but better than the torn dress she wore. He handed them to her. "These will be warmer," he said. She took them, holding the bundle against her chest. "Thank you." Then hesitantly, "Where should I change?" He gestured to the corner behind a hanging blanket he used as a partition for storage. "There, I will be outside." He left her to it, stepping back out into the cold morning. He busied himself with chores, checking the snares he had set near the tree line, splitting more firewood, anything to keep his hands occupied and his mind from circling the same question over and over. What now? What was he supposed to do with a child? He knew how to track, to hunt, to survive. He knew how to kill when necessary and disappear when it was not. But raising a little girl? Teaching her? Protecting her not just from danger, but from the world? That was a kind of responsibility he had walked away from when he buried his family. When he came back inside, Meadow was dressed in the oversized clothes, sleeves rolled up, trousers cinched with a piece of rope. She looked ridiculous and heartbreaking all at once, a tiny figure swimming in fabric meant for someone 3 times her size. But she was smiling, actually smiling, and when she saw him she did a little spin. "How do I look?" she asked. "Like you were wearing a tent," Toe said bluntly. She laughed, actually laughed bright and clear, and the sound hit him like a physical blow. He had not heard laughter in this cabin, not in 5 years, not since he built it. The walls seemed to shiver with the unfamiliarity of it, as if they too had forgotten what joy sounded like. Over the next few days, a routine formed. Toe would wake before dawn, tend to the fire, prepare food. Meadow would wake shortly after, quiet and watchful, learning the rhythms of his life without being told. He did not talk much, and she seemed to understand that silence was not rejection, just his way. But she asked questions, small ones at first. "What kind of tree is that? Why do you put tobacco in the fire? Can I help?" And slowly, reluctantly, he answered. Not with long explanations, but with truth. He taught her things without meaning to. How to identify edible plants, how to move quietly through the forest, how to read the signs animals left behind. She was a quick learner, sharp-eyed and careful, and she never complained. Not about the cold, not about the simple food, not about the lack of other children or toys or anything resembling a normal life. She just existed beside him, growing braver each day, reaching out in small ways. One afternoon, while he was repairing a fishing net, she sat beside him and began braiding sweetgrass, her small fingers clumsy but determined. He watched her from the corner of his eye, saying nothing, and when she finished, she held up the braid, crooked and uneven, and grinned. "For you," she said, offering it like a treasure. Toe stared at it, at her, at the simple, uncomplicated kindness in the gesture. His throat tightened. He took the braid carefully, as if it were made of spider silk, and tucked it into his shirt pocket. "Thank you," he said, and meant it. That night, after she had fallen asleep, he sat by the fire and pulled out the braid. He turned it over in his hands, feeling the texture, the effort she had put into making it. And for the first time in 5 years, he let himself remember. Not the fire, not the screams, but the small moments. His daughter braiding her mother's hair, his wife singing while she cooked. The way his home had felt full, alive, loved. The memories did not destroy him this time. They just ached, dull and deep, like an old wound that would never fully heal. But alongside the ache, something else stirred, something he did not have a name for yet, something warm and terrifying and impossible to ignore. 2 weeks passed, then 3. Meadow grew stronger, healthier. Her cheeks filled out, her eyes brightened, and she smiled more easily. She started talking more too, telling him stories about her parents, about the wagon train, about the other children who had teased her for being too small. She told him her favorite color was yellow, like the flowers in the meadow where she was born. She told him she was afraid of the dark but not of animals. She told him she missed her mama every single day, but that sometimes, when she woke up in the cabin with the fire crackling and him nearby, she felt almost safe. Toe listened. He did not offer platitudes or false promises. He just listened, and somehow that seemed to be enough. One morning, while they were walking back from checking the snares, Meadow stopped suddenly. She turned, alert, scanning for danger. But she was just standing there, staring at him with an expression he could not read. "What?" He asked. "You are not like other grown-ups," she said. "No," he agreed. "You do not lie. You do not pretend things are okay when they are not." Toe frowned. "Why would I?" "But," she shrugged, "everyone else does. They told me my parents were in a better place. They told me I would be fine. They told me lots of things that were not true." She looked down at her feet, scuffing the dirt. "But you do not do that. You just tell me the truth even when it is hard." He studied her, this small girl who had seen too much and lost too much, and still somehow found the courage to keep standing. "The truth is better," he said simply, "even when it hurts." She nodded slowly, then looked back up at him. "Can I ask you something? Why did you save me?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy and sharp. Joe was quiet for a long time, turning the words over in his mind, trying to find an answer that was both true and something she could understand. Finally he spoke, "Because no one should die alone in the dark." Meadow's eyes filled with tears, but she did not look away. "Is that what happened to your family?" Joe flinched. It was a small movement, barely visible, but she saw it. He had not told her about his family. He had not told her much of anything about himself. But she was perceptive, this child, far more than he had given her credit for. She had seen the pain he carried, recognized it because she carried her own. "Yes," he said finally, the words scraping out of him like broken glass. Meadow stepped forward and did something he did not expect. She reached out and took his hand, her small fingers wrapping around two of his, and she held on. She did not say anything. She did not try to make it better. She just held his hand and stood beside him, a tiny anchor in a world that had spent years trying to pull him under. And Toe Nighthawk, who had not cried since the day he found the ashes of his home, who had locked his grief so deep inside himself that he thought it had turned to stone, felt his eyes burn. He did not let the tears fall, not yet, but they were there, waiting, and for the first time, he did not fight them. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. They walked back to the cabin together, hand in hand, and neither of them spoke. But something had shifted between them, something fundamental and unbreakable. She was not just a child he had saved anymore, and he was not just a man keeping her alive. They were becoming something else. Something neither of them had words for yet. That evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in shades of fire and gold, Meadow sat on the porch steps, while Toe chopped wood nearby. She watched him work, the way his muscles moved beneath his shirt, the precise rhythm of the axe, the quiet competence in everything he did. After a while she spoke, her voice carrying across the clearing. "Hey, Hunter." He paused mid-swing, looked over at her. She had started calling him that a few days ago, and he had not corrected her. It was easier than explaining his real name, easier than hearing her try to pronounce it and getting it wrong. Hunter was simple. Hunter made sense. "Yes?" She smiled, soft and a little shy, and asked the question that had been building in her heart since the day he pulled her from the darkness. "Will you be my papa?" The axe slipped from Toe's hands. It hit the ground with a dull thud, blades sinking into the dirt. He stood frozen, staring at her, and the world seemed to stop. The wind died. The birds went silent. Even the creek seemed to hold its breath. And in that impossible, eternal moment, Toe felt every wall he had built around his heart crack and crumble. He crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides, dropped to his knees in front of her, and for the first time since he was a boy, he let the tears fall. They came hot and fast, carving lines down his face, dripping onto the dusty ground, and he could not stop them, did not want to, because this little girl, this brave, broken, beautiful child, had just offered him something he thought he had lost forever. A reason to live. Meadow wrapped her arms around his neck, holding him as tightly as her small body could manage, and whispered into his ear, "It is okay. I have got you." And Toe Nighthawk, the silent hunter, the giant who had walked through war and death and come out the other side alone, held her back and whispered the word that would change everything. "Yes." The town of Piedra Roja sat in a shallow valley, where the red earth met the sky like a wound that never healed. Adobe buildings lined the main street, their walls thick against the brutal summer heat and the bitter winter cold. Wooden awnings provided strips of shade where old men sat and watched the world pass by, with eyes that had seen too much and said too little. The saloon doors swung open and closed with the rhythm of bad decisions, and the church bell rang every Sunday, calling souls to salvation that most of them had given up on long ago. Joe had not been to Piedra Roja in 4 months, and he would have gone another 4 if he had the choice. But Meadow needed things he could not provide. Real clothes that fit, shoes that did not fall apart after a week, supplies for the winter that was coming faster than he liked. And though he would never admit it, part of him wanted to see if anyone was looking for her. If anyone cared that a little girl had been abandoned in the wilderness and left to die. They rode in just after noon, Meadow sitting in front of him on the saddle, her small hands gripping the pommel, eyes wide as she took in the town. It was bigger than anything she remembered, louder, filled with strangers and noise, and the smell of dust and horses and unwashed bodies. She pressed back against Toe's chest, seeking the safety of his presence, and he could feel her heart racing. "Stay close," he said quietly, and she nodded. He tied his horse outside the general store, a weathered building with a faded sign that read Morrison's Goods and Sundries. The windows were dusty, and the porch creaked underfoot, but it was the only place in town that sold what he needed. He pushed open the door, and a small bell chimed above their heads. Inside, the store smelled of leather and tobacco, and something sweet he could not identify. Shelves lined the walls, packed with everything from canned peaches to rifle ammunition. And in the back, behind a wooden counter, stood Walter Morrison himself. Walter was in his 60s, round-bellied and balding, with spectacles perched on the end of his nose and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He looked up as they entered, and his expression shifted from mild curiosity to poorly concealed surprise. Joe knew what he was thinking. The giant Navajo, who lived in the mountains like a ghost, had just walked into his store with a little white girl. And that was the kind of thing people talked about. "Toe," Walter said slowly, his voice careful, measured. "Been a while?" "Yes," Toe replied, moving deeper into the store. Meadow stayed glued to his side, one hand clutching the edge of his shirt. Walter's eyes flicked down to her, then back up to Toe. "This your daughter?" "Yes," Toe said without hesitation, and the word felt both true and terrifying. Walter raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He was smart enough to know when not to ask questions. "What can I do for you?" Joe moved through the store methodically, gathering what they needed. A dress for Meadow, simple and sturdy. A pair of boots that would last through the winter. Warm socks, a coat lined with wool. Flour, salt, dried beans, coffee. He piled everything on the counter, and Walter rang it up with steady hands, his expression neutral, but his mind clearly churning. While Walter worked, the door opened again, and 2 women entered. They were the kind of women who wore their respectability like armor, all tight buns and high collars and judgmental eyes. They stopped when they saw Toe, their conversation dying mid-sentence. One of them, a thin woman with a pinched face and the kind of mouth that looked like it had been sucking on lemons for years, stared at Meadow with open hostility. "Afternoon, Mrs. Calloway," Walter said politely, though his tone suggested he would rather swallow glass than engage in conversation. Mrs. Calloway ignored him. She stepped closer, her gaze fixed on Meadow. "And who might this be?" she asked, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Meadow shrank back, pressing herself against Toe's leg. He placed a hand on her shoulder, protective, unmistakable. "My daughter," he said again, his voice flat, daring her to challenge him. Mrs. Calloway's eyes narrowed. "Funny, I do not recall you having a daughter, or a wife for that matter." "Things changed," Toe said, handing Walter a stack of bills. He did not wait for change. He gathered the supplies, scooped Meadow into his arms, and turned toward the door. But Mrs. Calloway was not finished. She moved to block his path, her friend flanking her like a second line of defense. Now hold on just a minute. We have a right to know where this child came from. A decent woman does not just let a man like you take in a little girl without asking questions. He stopped. He looked down at her, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. His voice, when it came, was low and dangerous. A man like me? Mrs. Calloway lifted her chin, defiant. You know what I mean. A savage, an Indian. What business do you have raising a white child? The silence that followed was suffocating. Even Walter froze behind the counter, his hand hovering over the till. Meadow buried her face in Toe's shoulder, trembling. And Toe, who had faced down soldiers and outlaws and predators, both human and animal, felt a rage so cold and sharp it could have cut through steel. But he did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He simply looked at Mrs. Calloway with the kind of calm that came before storms and said she was dying in a mine shaft. I pulled her out. I fed her. I kept her safe. What have you done for her? Mrs. Calloway opened her mouth, then closed it again, her face flushing red. She had no answer because there was no answer. She had done nothing. None of them had. They had let a child fall through the cracks and told themselves it was not their problem. Toe stepped around her and walked out of the store, Meadow still in his arms, his supplies under one arm. He did not look back. Behind him, he heard Mrs. Calloway sputtering to her friend, something about reporting this to the sheriff, about the indecency of it all. He did not care. Let them talk. Let them report. He had done nothing wrong, except care for a child no one else wanted. He set Meadow on the saddle, climbed up behind her, and was about to ride out when a voice called his name. He turned to see a woman standing on the boardwalk outside the boarding house. She was younger than Mrs. Calloway, maybe 30, with dark hair pinned back and a dress that was clean but worn. Her face was pale, thin, and her eyes held the kind of exhaustion that came from carrying too much weight for too long. Her name was Catherine Brennan, and Toe knew her, though not well. She had come to Piedra Roja 2 years ago, running from something she never talked about. She worked as a seamstress and kept to herself, and the town respected her silence because she asked for nothing and caused no trouble. But there was something in the way she was looking at Meadow, something desperate and knowing, that made Toe pause. Wait, Catherine said, stepping off the boardwalk and approaching carefully, like she was afraid he would bolt. Please just wait. Toe said nothing, but he did not ride away. Catherine stopped a few feet from the horse, wringing her hands, her eyes flicking between him and Meadow. I am sorry about Mrs. Calloway. She is a bitter woman who finds meaning in making others miserable. She took a breath, steadying herself. But I need to ask you something. Ask, Tar said. Catherine looked at Meadow, really looked at her, and her expression crumbled. Is she safe with you, truly? The question surprised him. Not the words themselves, but the genuine concern behind them. Most people ask questions because they wanted to judge. Catherine was asking because she actually cared. Toe held her gaze unflinching. Yes. Catherine nodded slowly, as if she had expected that answer but needed to hear it anyway. Good, that is good. She hesitated, then added, if you ever need help. Clothes for her, or someone to talk to, or just a safe place to come. My door is open. No questions, no judgment. Just studied her, trying to understand why this stranger would offer kindness when so many others offered only suspicion. Why? Catherine's smile was sad, bitter around the edges. Because I know what it is like to run, and I know what it is like when someone offers you a hand instead of closing a door. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small cloth bundle tied with string. Here for the girl. It is not much, but it might help. Toe took the bundle, feeling the weight of it, the care that had gone into its making. He nodded once, a gesture of respect, and Catherine stepped back. Thank you, Meadow said softly, her voice barely audible. Catherine's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. You are welcome, little one. Be safe. They rode out of town as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Meadow was quiet, her small body tense, and Toe could feel the weight of what had happened pressing down on her. When they were far enough from Piedra Roja that the buildings were just smudges on the horizon, he stopped the horse near a cluster of cottonwood trees by a dry creek bed. He dismounted, lifted Meadow down, and handed her the bundle Catherine had given them. "Open it," he said. Meadow untied the string with careful fingers and unfolded the cloth. Inside was a small rag doll, hand-stitched with button eyes and yellow yarn hair. It was simple, imperfect, and clearly made with love. Meadow held it to her chest, and the tears she had been holding back finally came, silent and endless. Toe knelt beside her, his hand resting gently on her head. "What is wrong?" "They hate me," Meadow whispered, her voice breaking. "That woman, Mrs. Calloway, she looked at me like I was something bad. Like I do not belong." Toe's jaw tightened. "She is wrong, but what if she is right? What if people always look at me that way because I am with you?" Toe turned her to face him, his hands on her shoulders, his eyes fierce and unwavering. "Listen to me. People will always find reasons to hate. It does not matter what you do or who you love or how hard you try. Some people only know how to be angry and afraid, and they will take it out on anyone different from them." He paused, letting the words sink in. "But that is their weakness, not yours. You do not have to carry their hate. You only have to carry your own truth." Meadow sniffled, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "What is my truth?" Toe smiled just a little, the first real smile she had ever seen from him. "That you are brave, that you survived, and that you are mine, no matter what anyone else says." Meadow threw her arms around his neck, holding him tight, and Toe held her back. This small girl who had become his whole world without him even noticing. They stayed like that for a long time, under the cottonwood trees. As the sun set and the stars began to appear, tiny points of light in an endless sky. That night, back at the cabin, Toe sat by the fire while Meadow slept, the rag doll tucked under her arm. He thought about Catherine Brennan and her unexpected kindness. He thought about Mrs. Calloway and the poison in her words. And he thought about the future, the one he had been avoiding since the day he pulled Meadow from the mine shaft. Because keeping her safe in the wilderness was one thing, but keeping her safe from the world, from people who would judge her for loving him and judge him for daring to be her father, that was something else entirely. That was a fight he was not sure he could win. But as he looked at her sleeping peacefully, her small chest rising and falling, he knew he would try. He would fight every battle, face every enemy, endure every hateful word, because she was his daughter now. Not by blood, not by law, but by choice. And that made it real. The next morning, Toe did something he had not done in years. He rode to the edge of his property, where an old oak tree stood gnarled and ancient, and he began to carve. His knife moved with precision, cutting into the bark, shaping letters, forming words. It took hours, but he did not stop until it was finished. When Meadow found him that afternoon, she stared at the tree, at the words he had carved deep and permanent. "What does it say?" she asked. Toe stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. "It says, 'Here lives Toe Nighthawk and his daughter Meadow. All who enter with hate will leave with nothing.'" Meadow looked up at him, her eyes shining. "You really mean it? I am your daughter?" "Yes," Toe said, and this time there was no hesitation, no doubt. Just certainty. She hugged him tight, and he held her close, and in that moment the world could have burned around them, and neither would have noticed, because they had each other. And that was enough. But far away in the town of Piedra Roja, Mrs. Calloway sat at her kitchen table, pen in hand, writing a letter to the territorial marshal. She wrote about the savage in the mountains. She wrote about the little white girl he had stolen. She wrote lies dressed up as concern, and when she was finished, she sealed the letter with wax and smiled, because some people only knew how to destroy, and she had just lit the fuse. Winter came early that year, sweeping down from the mountains like a grey wolf on the hunt. The first snow fell in thick, silent curtains, blanketing the forest in white, and turning the world into something clean and cold and unforgiving. Toe had prepared well, stocking the cabin with enough supplies to last through the hardest months and teaching Meadow the skills she would need to survive if something ever happened to him. She learned to split kindling, to tend the fire, to recognize the signs of a storm before it arrived. She was a quick study, eager to please, and though she was still small, she carried herself with a confidence that had not been there when he first pulled her from the darkness. The days fell into a rhythm. Wake before dawn, tend the animals, check the traps, chop wood, melt snow for water, cook, eat, repair what needed repairing. Tell stories by the fire, sleep, repeat. It was a simple life, hard and unadorned, but it was theirs. And for a while, Toe allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could stay hidden from the world forever. But the world had a way of finding you, even when you did not want to be found. The marshal arrived on a bitter afternoon in late January, riding through the snow with 2 deputies flanking him, like vultures circling a dying animal. Who saw them coming from a mile away, 3 dark shapes against the white expanse, moving with the deliberate purpose of men on official business. He watched from the tree line, bow in hand, tracking their progress as they climbed the trail toward his cabin. Meadow was inside, safe and warm, unaware of the danger approaching. He intended to keep it that way. He moved through the forest like smoke, silent and invisible, positioning himself between the riders and the cabin. When they were close enough, he stepped out from behind a pine tree. Bow-drawn, arrow nocked, and his voice cut through the cold air like a blade. That is far enough. The 3 men reined in hard, their horses snorting and stamping in the snow. The marshal, a lean man in his 50s with a steel-grey mustache and eyes like chips of flint, raised one hand in a gesture that was meant to be placating but came across as condescending. Easy now, Nighthawk. We are not here for trouble. Then turn around, Toe said, his voice flat, the arrow still aimed at the marshal's chest. The marshal sighed, his breath misting in the cold. You know I cannot do that. We have had reports, concerns about a child. A little girl, white, living up here with you. He shifted in his saddle, trying to look reasonable, trying to look like a man just doing his job. Now I am sure there is a reasonable explanation. But we need to see her. We need to make sure she is safe. She is safe, Toe said. I believe you, the marshal replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. But belief is not enough. The law requires us to verify. So how about you lower that bow, invite us in for some coffee, and we can sort this out like civilized men. Etta did not move. She is my daughter. You have no right to her. One of the deputies, a younger man with a scraggly beard and the kind of arrogance that came from wearing a badge, sneered. You do not have a daughter, Indian. You have a stolen child, and we are taking her back to where she belongs. The arrow shifted, pointing now at the deputy. Toad's expression did not change, but something in his eyes went cold and dead, the look of a man who had killed before and would not hesitate to do it again. Say that again, he said quietly. The marshal shot the deputy a warning glare, then turned back to Toe. Nobody is stealing anybody. But there are questions, Nighthawk. Questions about where she came from, about whether you have any legal claim to her. Mrs. Calloway filed a report with the territorial office. They sent me to investigate. He paused, letting that sink in. Now, I can do this easy or I can do this hard. Your choice. To weigh his options, he could kill all 3 of them. It would not be difficult. 1 arrow for the deputy, a second for the other, and the marshal would be fumbling for his gun before Toe put a 3rd shaft through his throat. But then what? More men would come, the army maybe, and Meadow would be caught in the crossfire, or worse, taken from him while he was dead or in chains. No, violence was not the answer here. Not yet. He lowered the bow slowly, deliberately, and stepped aside. She's inside. You can see her, but you do not touch her. You do not take her, and if you frighten her, I will put an arrow in your spine before you reach your horse. The marshal nodded, dismounting carefully. The deputies followed, though the younger one kept his hand on his pistol, and together they walked toward the cabin. Toe moved ahead of them, opening the door and stepping inside. Meadow was sitting by the fire, the rag doll in her lap, and she looked up as he entered, her smile bright and trusting. "Papa," she said, and the word hung in the air like a declaration of war. The marshal stepped inside behind Toe, removing his hat, his eyes scanning the cabin. It was clean, well-kept, warm, supplies stacked neatly on shelves, firewood piled by the hearth, a bed in the corner with blankets folded precisely. No sign of neglect, no sign of harm, just a home, simple and functional, where a man and his daughter lived. "Hello there, little miss," the marshal said, his voice softening in that way adults did when they talked to children, like they were fragile things that might break if spoken to normally. "My name is Marshal Garrett. What is your name?" Meadow looked at Toe, uncertain. He nodded once, and she turned back to the marshal. "Meadow," she said quietly. "That is a pretty name," Garrett said, crouching down to her level. "Can you tell me how you came to be here, Meadow? With Mr. Nighthawk?" Meadow's hand tightened on the doll. "He saved me. I fell in a hole and he pulled me out. He brought me here and took care of me." "I see," Garrett said, glancing at Toe. "And has he been good to you? Has he hurt you in any way?" Meadow's eyes went wide with shock, then anger. "No, he would never hurt me. He is my papa. He loves me." Garrett held up his hands. All right. I believe you. I just had to ask." He stood, brushing off his knees, and looked around the cabin again. "You have done well for her, Nighthawk. I will give you that. But the problem is, she is not legally yours. She has no papers, no proof of kinship, and that makes this complicated." "She was abandoned," Toe said, his voice hard. "Left to die by people who should have protected her. I gave her life. That makes her mine." "In your eyes, maybe," Garrett said, "but not in the eyes of the law. And the law says a child without kin belongs to the state until suitable guardians can be found. That means she needs to come with me, to Piedra Roja, at least temporarily while we sort this out." "No," Toe said, and the word was absolute. Garrett sighed, rubbing his face. "I was afraid you would say that." He looked at Meadow, who was now clinging to Toe's leg, tears streaming down her face. "Listen, I'm not a monster. I do not want to take her from you, but I have a job to do. There are rules, procedures. If you fight me on this, it will only make things worse. For both of you." Toe stared at him, and in that moment he hated the law more than he had ever hated anything in his life. Hated the way it pretended to care about children while ripping them from the only safety they had ever known. Hated the way it wrapped cruelty in the language of duty and righteousness. But he also saw the truth in Garrett's eyes. The marshal was not lying. He was just a cog in a machine that ground people to dust, and fighting him would only give that machine more ammunition. "How long?" Toe asked. Garrett blinked, surprised. "What? How long until this is sorted out?" Garrett hesitated. "I do not know. A few weeks, maybe. A month. It depends on whether anyone comes forward to claim her or whether the territorial office decides you are fit to keep her." "And if I come with her?" "To Prest. If I stay in town, prove I can provide for her. Prove I am not a threat." Garrett considered this, then nodded slowly. "That might work. It would show good faith. Make the process easier." He paused. "But you would have to follow the rules. Stay where we can find you. Submit to inspections. Let people see that you are doing right by her." He looked down at Meadow, who was sobbing quietly into his leg, her small body shaking with fear. He knelt, pulling her into his arms, and whispered into her hair, "It is going to be all right. I am not leaving you. I will be with you every step of the way. I promise." She clung to him, her voice muffled against his chest. "I do not want to go. I want to stay here." "I know," he said, his own voice breaking just slightly. "But sometimes we have to do hard things to protect what we love. And I love you. So we are going to go to town, and we are going to show them that you belong with me. And then we are going to come home, together." Meadow pulled back, looking up at him with tear-streaked cheeks. "You promise?" "Oh, and I promise," he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. They packed what they needed, and by the time the sun was setting, they were riding down the mountain, Toe and Meadow on his gelding, the marshal and his deputies trailing behind. The snow had started falling again, thick and heavy, and the world was silent except for the crunch of hooves and the wind whispering through the trees. Meadow sat in front of Toe, wrapped in his coat. her head resting against his chest, and he held her close, one hand on the reins, the other around her small body, shielding her from the cold and the world. Piedra Roja looked different in winter, smaller and meaner, like a wounded animal curled in on itself. The streets were empty, most people huddled inside against the cold, and the few who ventured out stared openly as Tow rode through town with the marshal. Whispers followed them, sharp and cutting, and more than once Tow caught the glint of eyes watching from behind curtains. Marshal Garrett led them to a boarding house on the edge of town, a 2-story building with peeling paint and a sagging porch. The proprietor, a gaunt woman named Mrs. Fletcher, eyed Tow with suspicion, but said nothing, just handed him a key and pointed to a room on the 2nd floor. It was small, barely large enough for a bed and a chair, but it was warm and clean, and that was enough. Tow set Meadow on the bed and knelt in front of her, brushing the snow from her hair. "We will stay here for now, just until this is over." Meadow nodded, but her eyes were dull with exhaustion and fear. "What if they take me away? What if you cannot stop them?" "I will stop them," Tow said fiercely. "No one is taking you from me. Not the law, not the marshal, not anyone. You are mine, Meadow, and I am yours. Nothing will change that." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. She threw her arms around his neck, holding on like he was the only solid thing in a world that had gone liquid and unstable. And Tow held her back, this little girl who had become his entire reason for breathing. And he swore to himself that he would burn the world down before he let anyone take her from him. The days that followed were some of the hardest of Tow's life. Every morning, Marshal Garrett would stop by to check on them, asking questions, taking notes, treating Tow like a suspect in a crime he had not committed. The questions were always the same, asked in different ways, as if Garrett thought he could catch Tow in a lie. "Where did you find her? How long has she been with you? Has anyone else seen her? Do you have any documentation? Any proof of guardianship?" Tow answered each question with the same patient restraint, never raising his voice, never showing the anger that simmered beneath his calm exterior. The townspeople were worse. They stared openly, whispered behind their hands, and more than once Tow caught the glint of hatred in their eyes. Women pulled their children away when Meadow tried to smile at them. Men muttered under their breath about savages and stolen children. The blacksmith refused to shoe Tow's horse. The general store suddenly had no supplies to sell him. Even the saloon, which usually welcomed anyone with money, turned him away at the door. Mrs. Calloway made herself a fixture outside the boarding house, standing on the opposite side of the street, arms crossed, watching like a hawk waiting for a mouse to make a mistake. She was there every morning when Tow and Meadow left, and every evening when they returned. Sometimes she would mutter loud enough for them to hear, poisonous words about decency and propriety and the natural order of things. Tow ignored her, but Meadow heard every word, and each one cut deeper than the last. One afternoon, as they walked back from the marshal's office, a group of boys threw rocks at them, shouting names Tow had heard before, but had hoped Meadow would never have to endure. One of the rocks hit her in the shoulder, and she cried out, stumbling. Tow caught her, his rage flaring white-hot, and he turned on the boys with murder in his eyes. They scattered like leaves in a storm, disappearing into alleyways and behind buildings. And Tow was left standing in the middle of the street, breathing hard. His fists clenched so tight his knuckles had gone white. Meadow touched his arm, her voice small. "It is okay, Papa, I am okay." But she was not okay. He could see it in the way she held herself, in the way her smile had become forced, in the way she flinched at loud noises and sudden movements. The town was breaking her piece by piece, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. But there were others, too. Catherine Brennan came by every few days, bringing food and small gifts for Meadow, offering quiet words of encouragement. She brought a book of fairy tales, worn and well-loved, and read to Meadow in the evenings while Tow sat nearby, listening to the soft cadence of her voice. She never asked intrusive questions. She never judged. She just offered kindness in a place that had precious little of it, Walter Morrison stopped Toe on the street one afternoon and told him, gruffly, that not everyone in town thought he was a monster. "There are decent folks here," Walter said, glancing around nervously as if afraid someone might overhear. "They just do not speak as loud as the hateful ones. But they see what you are doing. They see how you care for that girl, and when the time comes, they will remember." Even Father Delgado, the old priest who ran the mission, sought Toe out and offered to testify on his behalf if it came to that. "I have seen many men in my years," the priest said, his voice thick with a Spanish accent. "Good men, bad men, men who pretend to be one while being the other. But you, Senor Nighthawk, you are a good man, and that child loves you. That is all that matters in the eyes of God." Toe did not believe in God. Not anymore, not after everything he had seen and lost. But he appreciated the sentiment, and he thanked the priest with genuine gratitude, and through it all, Meadow stayed by Toe's side, brave and bright, her presence a constant reminder of why he was enduring this humiliation. She smiled when people scowled. She waved when they turned away. And she never once stopped calling him Papa, loud enough for anyone within earshot to hear. She was fighting in her own way, with the weapons she had, and Toe had never been more proud of anyone in his life. 2 weeks passed, then 3, and just when Toe thought he might survive this, that the law might actually see reason and let him keep his daughter, everything fell apart. A man arrived in town on a cold, clear morning in early February. He came in a fancy carriage, pulled by matching black horses, dressed in an expensive suit with a gold watch chain glinting at his waist. His name was Richard Pemberton, and he moved through the world with the easy confidence of someone who had never been told no. He was tall, clean-shaven, with slicked-back hair and a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. He went directly to the marshal's office, carrying a leather satchel filled with documents, and within an hour the entire town was buzzing with the news. Richard Pemberton claimed to be Meadow's uncle, her mother's brother, he said, who had been searching for her ever since he heard about the tragedy that had taken her parents. He had papers, official-looking documents with stamps and seals, and he had come to take her back east to Boston, where she would be raised in a proper home with proper people, educated and civilized and given all the opportunities a young lady deserved. To heard the news from Catherine, who came running to the boarding house breathless and pale. "You need to see the marshal," she said urgently. Now, before this goes any further, Toe did not wait. He grabbed his coat, told Meadow to stay in the room and lock the door, and strode through the snow to the marshal's office, with Catherine hurrying beside him. When he pushed open the door, he found Marshal Garrett sitting behind his desk, Richard Pemberton in the chair across from him, and a smug smile on the stranger's face that made Toe want to put his fist through it. "Ah, Mr. Nighthawk," Pemberton said, standing and extending a hand. "I have heard so much about you. Thank you for taking care of my niece in her time of need. I'm sure it was a burden, but I am here now, and I will relieve you of that responsibility." Toe ignored the offered hand. He looked at Garrett. "Is this true? Is he her uncle?" Garrett shifted uncomfortably. "He has documents. Birth certificates, family records, letters from her mother. It all looks legitimate." "Looks legitimate is not the same as being legitimate," Toe said. Pemberton laughed, a condescending sound that grated like sandpaper. "I assure you, Mr. Nighthawk, everything is in order. I've been searching for Meadow for months. When I heard she had been abandoned by that wagon train, I feared the worst. But here she is, safe and sound, thanks to you. And now I will take her home, where she belongs." "She is home," Toe said, his voice low and dangerous. "With me." Pemberton's smile faded. "I understand you have grown attached to her, but she is not your daughter. She is my blood, and the law will side with me." To turn to Garrett. "Let me see the documents." Garrett hesitated, then slid the papers across the desk. Drew picked them up, scanning them with a critical eye. They were good, he had to admit, professional, convincing, but something about them felt wrong. The dates did not quite line up. The handwriting on one letter looked different from the others, and the seal on the birth certificate was smudged, as if it had been applied hastily. "These are fake," Toe said flatly. Pemberton's expression hardened. "That is a serious accusation, Mr. Nighthawk. Do you have any proof?" "Do you?" Toe shot back. "Where were you when she was dying in that mine shaft? Where were you when she was starving and alone? You claim to be her family, but you were not there when she needed you most." "I did not know where she was," Pemberton said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "But I am here now, and I am taking her home." Toe stepped forward, and Pemberton instinctively took a step back. "You are not taking her anywhere," Toe said, and every word was a promise carved in stone. The tension in the marshal's office was thick enough to choke on. Richard Pemberton stood with his back against the wall, his earlier confidence cracking at the edges as Toe Nighthawk loomed over him like a mountain ready to fall. Marshal Garrett had risen from his chair, one hand hovering near his pistol, not because he wanted to draw it, but because he was afraid he might have to. "Gentlemen," Garrett said, his voice strained but authoritative, "let us all take a breath and handle this like reasonable men." "There is nothing reasonable about letting a stranger take my daughter," Toe said, his eyes never leaving Pemberton's face. "She is not your daughter," Pemberton insisted, though his voice had lost its smooth edge. "She is my niece. I have the papers to prove it. Papers can be forged," Catherine Brennan said from the doorway. Everyone turned to look at her. She stepped inside, her expression determined, and moved to stand beside Toe. "I know something about forged documents, Mr. Pemberton. I had to use them myself once, to escape a man who claimed to own me. And those papers you have, they look just a little too perfect." Pemberton's jaw tightened. "This is absurd. I will not be accused by some backwater seamstress and a savage who thinks he can play father to a white child." The words had barely left his mouth when Toe moved. It was not a punch, not a shove, just a step forward so swift and sudden that Pemberton flinched and stumbled backward, hitting the wall hard enough to rattle the window. Toe did not touch him. He did not have to. The threat was written in every line of his body, in the cold fury burning in his eyes. "Call me that again," Toe said softly. "And papers will not matter because you will not be alive to present them." "Enough," Garrett barked, stepping between them. "Nighthawk, back off. Pemberton, keep your mouth shut. I will not have bloodshed in my office." He turned to Toe, his expression grave. "I understand your anger, but threatening a man, no matter how deserving, is not going to help your case." Toe took a step back, forcing himself to breathe, to think. Violence would only prove what people like Mrs. Calloway and Pemberton wanted everyone to believe, that he was a savage, dangerous, and unfit to raise a child. He had to be smarter than that. He had to fight them with the same weapons they were using against him. "Give me time," Toe said to Garrett. 3 days. Let me prove those documents are fake." Garrett frowned. "How?" "Now there is a man in Santa Fe, a clerk in the territorial office. He knows every seal, every signature, every piece of official paper that comes through New Mexico. If those documents are forged, he will know." Pemberton laughed, though it sounded forced. "This is ridiculous." "You are stalling, then you should have no problem waiting," Catherine said sharply. "If your documents are real, 3 days will not change anything. But if they are not, then you are the one who should be worried." Garrett looked between them, weighing his options. Finally he nodded. 3 days. "But Pemberton, you stay in town. And Nighthawk, you do not leave either. I want both of you where I can see you." Pemberton opened his mouth to protest, then thought better of it. He straightened his jacket, picked up his hat, and walked to the door. Before leaving, he turned back, his smile returning, cold and thin. 3 days then. But when this is over, I will be taking Meadow with me. And there is nothing you can do to stop it." The door closed behind him, and the room let out a collective breath. He turned to Catherine. "Thank you." She shook her head. "Do not thank me yet. We still have to prove he is lying. I will ride to Santa Fe tonight," Toe said. "If I leave now, I can be there by morning." "And what about Meadow?" Garrett asked. "You cannot leave her alone." She will stay with me, Catherine said immediately. She will be safe. I promise. Tu looked at her, searching her face for any sign of doubt or hesitation. He found none, just quiet strength and a determination that matched his own. He nodded once. I will tell her. The ride back to the boarding house felt longer than it should have. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the snow, and the wind had picked up, carrying with it the promise of another storm. When Toe opened the door to their room, he found Meadow sitting on the bed, the rag doll clutched in her hands, her eyes red from crying. I heard, she said quietly. Mrs. Fletcher was talking to someone downstairs. She said a man came to take me away. Tu knelt in front of her, taking her small hands in his. That man is a liar, and I am going to prove it, What if you cannot? Meadow's voice broke. What if they make me go with him? They will not, Toe said fiercely. I will not let that happen. But I need to leave for a little while, just 2 days. I have to go to Santa Fe to get the proof we need. Meadow's grip tightened. No, do not leave me, please. You will stay with Catherine. She will keep you safe. And I will come back. I swear to you I will come back. Tears spilled down Meadow's cheeks. You promise? I promise, Toe said, pulling her into his arms. Nothing in this world will keep me from coming back to you. Nothing. He held her for a long time, feeling the way her small body shook with sobs, and his heart broke a little more with each one. But he could not afford to break completely, not yet, not when she needed him to be strong. An hour later, Toe stood outside Catherine's small house on the edge of town. Meadow was inside, sitting by the fire wrapped in a blanket, her eyes hollow with fear and exhaustion. Catherine walked Toe to the door, her expression serious. I will protect her with my life, she said. I know, Toe replied. He hesitated, then added, Why are you doing this? You barely know us. Catherine smiled sadly. Because I know what it is like to be alone and afraid. And I know what it is like when someone finally offers you a hand instead of a fist. You gave that to Meadow. The least I can do is help you keep her. Toe nodded, unable to find words that felt adequate. He turned to go, then stopped and looked back. If Pemberton comes near her, if he tries anything, you send word to the marshal, and you do not open the door for anyone. I understand, Catherine said. Now go and ride fast. The journey to Santa Fe was brutal. The storm, too, had sensed earlier hit hard, turning the world into a whiteout of wind and snow. His gelding struggled through drifts that came up to its chest, and more than once, Toe had to dismount and lead the animal by hand, breaking trail through the blinding cold. He did not stop, did not rest. Every minute he wasted was a minute Pemberton could use to disappear with Meadow, and that thought drove him forward like a whip. He reached Santa Fe just as dawn broke, exhausted and half-frozen, but alive. The city was waking, smoke rising from chimneys, vendors setting up stalls in the plaza. Toe did not stop to admire it. He went straight to the territorial office, a squat adobe building near the governor's palace, and demanded to see the clerk he knew. The man's name was Tomas Herrera, and he had served in the same unit as Toe during the war. They were not friends exactly, but they had saved each other's lives more than once, and that created a bond stronger than friendship. When Tomas saw Toe standing in the doorway, covered in snow and looking like death warmed over, he dropped the ledger he was holding and rushed forward. Dios mío, Toe! What happened to you? I need your help, Toe said without preamble. He pulled the documents Pemberton had presented from inside his coat and laid them on Tomas's desk. Tell me if these are real. Tomas picked them up, his expression shifting from concern to professional focus. He studied each page carefully, holding them up to the light, running his fingers over the seals, comparing signatures to samples in his files. The silence stretched, broken only by the ticking of a clock on the wall and the sound of Tomas muttering to himself in Spanish. Finally, he set the papers down and looked at Toe. They are fake. Very good fakes, but fake. Relief flooded through Toe so powerfully he almost staggered. You are sure? Positive. The seal is wrong. It is close, but the design is off by a fraction. And the signature here, it is supposed to be from Judge Hawthorne, but I know his handwriting. This is not it. Thomas leaned back in his chair, frowning. Where did you get these? A man named Richard Pemberton. He is trying to take my daughter. Thomas raised an eyebrow. You have a daughter? Yes. Since when? It is a long story, Toe said, but I need you to come back to Piedra Roja with me. I need you to testify that these documents are forged. Tomas whistled low. That is a big ask, amigo. I have work here, responsibilities. I know, Toe said. But I'm asking anyway. Please. Tomas studied him for a long moment, then sighed. You saved my life at Glorieta Pass. I suppose I owe you one. He stood, grabbing his coat from the hook on the wall. Let me tell my supervisor. We leave in an hour. The ride back to Piedra Roja was faster, the storm having passed and the sun breaking through the clouds. Tomas rode beside Toe, asking questions about Meadow, about how she had come into his life, and Toe answered, surprised to find that talking about her made the exhaustion feel lighter. By the time they reached the town, the sun was setting again, painting the snow in shades of gold and pink. Toe went straight to Catherine's house, his heart pounding. When she opened the door, he saw Meadow behind her, safe and whole, and the relief nearly brought him to his knees. Meadow ran to him, throwing her arms around his waist, and he held her tight, burying his face in her hair. I told you I would come back, he murmured. I know, she whispered. I knew you would. The next morning, Marshal Garrett called a hearing in the town hall. It was not an official trial, just a gathering to determine the truth, but half the town showed up, drawn by curiosity and the promise of drama. Toe sat at one table with Meadow beside him, Catherine on his other side. Across the room, Richard Pemberton sat alone, his expression confident, his posture relaxed. He clearly believed he had already won. Garrett stood at the front of the room, calling for order. We are here to settle the matter of Meadow's guardianship. Mr. Pemberton claims to be her uncle and has presented documents to support that claim. Mr. Nighthawk disputes those documents and has brought a witness to testify. We will hear both sides and make a decision. Pemberton stood, smooth and polished. Marshal, I appreciate the opportunity to present my case. As I have stated, Meadow is my niece. I have birth certificates, family records, and letters from her late mother. Everything is in order. I'm here to take her home, to give her the life she deserves. And where is home, Mr. Pemberton? Garrett asked. Boston. I own a textile company there. I can provide for her, educate her, give her opportunities she will never have in this wilderness. Sounds nice, Garrett said. But Mr. Nighthawk has raised questions about your documents. Mr. Herrera, would you come forward? Tomas stood, walking to the front of the room. He laid the documents on a table where everyone could see them, then began to explain, point by point, why they were fake. The seal was wrong. The signature did not match. The paper itself was too new, too clean, for documents that were supposed to be years old. As he spoke, Pemberton's confidence began to crumble. His smile faded, his hands clenched into fists. These are forgeries, Tomas concluded. I would stake my reputation on it. The room erupted in whispers. Garrett banged his gavel for silence. Mr. Pemberton, do you have anything to say in your defense? Pemberton stood, his face red with anger. This is absurd. You are taking the word of a government clerk over official documents? And official documents that are fake, Garrett said flatly. Which makes me wonder if you are really her uncle. Why would you need to forge papers? Pemberton said nothing. His jaw worked, but no words came out. And in that silence, the truth became clear. He was not her uncle. He was a liar. Maybe he had heard about a lost child and seen an opportunity. Maybe he had debts to pay or a reputation to salvage. It did not matter. What mattered was that he had tried to steal Meadow and he had failed. Garrett stood, his expression grim. Mr. Pemberton, you are under arrest for fraud and attempted kidnapping. Deputies, take him away. As the deputies moved forward, Pemberton's composure shattered completely. He lunged toward Meadow, shouting that she was his, that she belonged to him. But Toe was faster. He stepped in front of her, one massive hand catching Pemberton by the throat and slamming him against the wall. The room went silent. He leaned in close, his voice low and deadly. "You will never touch her. You will never speak her name. And if I ever see you again, I will finish what I started here." He released Pemberton, who crumpled to the floor, gasping. The deputies dragged him out, and the room erupted in noise, some people cheering, others arguing. And through it all, Toe knelt and pulled Meadow into his arms. "It is over," he said. "You are safe. You are mine, and no one will ever take you from me again." Meadow clung to him, sobbing with relief, and Toe held her, his own tears finally falling, hot and unstoppable. Around them, the town watched, and for the first time, some of them saw not a savage, but a father. In the weeks that followed, life began to settle. Garrett expedited the paperwork, making Toe Meadows legal guardian. And though there were still people in town who disapproved, their voices grew quieter. Catherine became a regular visitor to the cabin, bringing supplies and companionship. And slowly, cautiously, Toe began to trust that maybe, just maybe, they could have a future. Spring came, melting the snow and bringing wildflowers to the meadows. Toe taught Meadow to ride, to track, to read the land the way his grandfather had taught him. She grew stronger, braver, her laughter echoing through the forest like a song. And one evening, as they sat by the fire, she looked up at him and asked a question that had been building in her heart for months. "Papa, will you teach me your language, the Navajo words?" Toe looked at her surprised. "Why?" "Because it is part of you, and you are part of me. I want to know everything." Toe smiled, the first real, unguarded smile in more years than he could count. "Yes, I will teach you." And so he did. Night after night he taught her words, phrases, stories passed down through generations. He taught her about the land, the spirits, the way his people saw the world. And she absorbed it all, hungry for knowledge, for connection, for roots in a world that had tried so hard to tear her away. Years passed. Meadow grew from a little girl into a young woman, strong and capable, with her father's quiet strength and her own fierce spirit. She never forgot where she came from, but she also never doubted where she belonged. And Toe, the silent hunter who had once believed he would die alone, found that life had given him a second chance at love, at family, at hope. On the day Meadow turned 16, they stood together on the ridge overlooking the valley, the same place where their story had begun. The wind was warm, carrying the scent of sage and pine, and the sky stretched endless and blue above them. "Do you ever regret it?" Meadow asked. "Taking me in? Changing your life?" Toe looked at her, this girl who had become his whole world, and shook his head. "Never. You gave me a reason to live. You gave me everything." Meadow smiled, tears in her eyes, and took his hand. "You gave me everything too, Papa. You gave me a home. You gave me love. You gave me you." And as they stood there, father and daughter, the sun setting behind them, the world stretched out before them, full of possibility and promise. They had survived the darkness. They had fought the world and won. And now, together, they would face whatever came next, because sometimes the greatest families are not born. They are chosen. They are built in the wilderness, forged in fire, and held together by love stronger than blood. And Toe Nighthawk and Meadow, the giant and the little girl who had saved each other, were proof that even in the harshest lands, even in the coldest winters, love could take root and grow. This is Wild West love stories, where the bravest hearts find their way home, not through blood but through choice, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bonds forged in the wild. 10 years had passed since the day Toe Nighthawk pulled a terrified little girl from the darkness of an abandoned mine shaft. 10 years since Meadow had looked up at a giant stranger and asked him to be her papa. 10 years since two broken souls had found each other in the wilderness and decided that family was not something you were born into, but something you built with your own hands. The cabin had grown. What had once been a simple one-room structure now sprawled across the clearing, with an addition for Meadow's room, a larger kitchen, a workshop where Toe crafted bows and arrows to sell in town, and a covered porch that wrapped around 3 sides. The garden had expanded too, rows of vegetables and herbs that Meadow tended with the same care Toe had once shown her. Chickens pecked in a fenced yard, and a small stable housed 3 horses now, including Meadow's mare, a spirited paint she had named Sunrise. The forest around them had become a second home. Meadow knew every trail, every stream, every hidden grove where wild berries grew thick in summer. She could track a deer through dense underbrush, set a snare that would hold without harming, and read the sky for weather changes hours before they arrived. Drew had taught her everything he knew, and she had absorbed it all with a hunger that reminded him of himself at that age, before the world had tried to break him. But she had learned more than survival skills. Who had taught her the Navajo language, not just words, but the philosophy behind them, the way his people understood the world as a place of balance and harmony. He taught her the songs his grandmother had sung, the stories his grandfather had told, the prayers that honored the land and the spirits that dwelled within it. And Meadow, who had been born white but raised Navajo, carried both worlds within her heart, building bridges between them that neither existed alone. She was 17 now, tall and strong, with sun-darkened skin and hair that had darkened from blonde to honey brown. Her hands were calloused from work, her eyes sharp from watching the horizon, and her laugh still rang through the forest like bells. She moved through the world with a confidence that came from knowing exactly who she was and where she belonged. She was Toe's daughter, and that was all the identity she needed. On a warm afternoon in late summer, Meadow sat on the porch steps, repairing a bridle while Toe split wood nearby. The rhythmic sound of the axe biting into logs was comforting, familiar, a soundtrack to their lives. They worked in companionable silence, the kind that only came from years of understanding each other without needing to fill every moment with words. A rider appeared on the trail, and both of them looked up. Visitors were rare but not unheard of. As the figure drew closer, Meadow recognized the horse first, then the rider. It was Catherine Brennan, though she looked different now. Her dark hair was streaked with gray, and she wore it loose around her shoulders. Her face had softened with age, but her eyes still held that same quiet strength that had made her reach out to them all those years ago. Two set down the axe and walked to meet her, Meadow following close behind. Catherine dismounted with a smile, but there was something sad in her expression, something heavy. She embraced Meadow first, holding her tight, then turned to Toe. "It is good to see you both," Catherine said. "It has been too long." 3 months, Meadow said. "You came for my birthday, remember?" "Of course I remember," Catherine replied. "But 3 months can feel like a lifetime when you get to be my age." She paused, glancing between them. "I have news. And I wanted you to hear it from me before the town started talking." Toe's expression darkened slightly. "What news?" Catherine took a breath. "Mrs. Calloway passed away 2 weeks ago. Heart failure, the doctor said. She was found in her parlor, alone." She looked down at her hands. "I know she made your lives difficult. I know she said terrible things. But I thought you should know." Meadow felt a complicated tangle of emotions. She had not thought about Mrs. Calloway in years, had pushed the memory of that bitter woman into the back of her mind, where all unpleasant things went to gather dust. But hearing that she was dead brought it all back, the fear, the hatred in those eyes, the way she had tried to tear their family apart. "Did she have anyone?" Meadow asked quietly. "Any family?" Catherine shook her head. "No, she outlived her husband by 20 years, and they never had children. The funeral was small, just a handful of people who felt obligated to attend." She hesitated. "I went, not because I liked her, but because no one should die completely alone and unmourned." Toe was silent for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he spoke, his voice low. "She spent her life spreading hate, and in the end, hate was all she had." He looked at Catherine. "Thank you for telling us, and thank you for being there when no one else was." Catherine nodded, then brightened slightly. "But I have other news too. Better news. Walter Morrison is retiring. He is selling the general store. Who is buying it?" Meadow asked. "I am," Catherine said, a smile breaking through. with some help from Father Delgado and a few others who believe the town needs a store run by someone with a heart. She looked at Meadow. And I was hoping you might want to work there. Part-time, at least. You know the land, you know the people, and you would be good with customers. Meadow glanced at Toe, uncertain. She had never considered leaving the mountain, even temporarily. This was her home, her sanctuary. But she also understood what Catherine was offering. A chance to be part of the town, to show people that she was more than just the Indian's daughter, that she was her own person with her own voice. I will think about it, Meadow said carefully. That is all I ask, Catherine replied. She stayed for dinner, sharing stories and laughter, and when she left as the sun was setting, Meadow and Toe stood on the porch, watching her disappear down the trail. Do you want to do it? Toe asked. Work in town. Meadow was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. I think I do. Not because I want to leave here, but because I want to show them that I am not afraid. That we are not afraid. She looked up at him. You taught me to be brave, Papa. This feels like the next step. Toe smiled, pride glowing in his eyes. Then you should do it. But you come home every night. I do not care how late it is. Always, Meadow promised. She started working at the store 2 weeks later, riding into town 3 days a week and returning to the cabin each evening. At first, some of the old prejudices surfaced. There were whispers, sidelong glances, customers who refused to let her help them. But Meadow faced it all with the same calm determination Toe had shown her, never rising to the bait, never giving them the reaction they wanted. And slowly, grudgingly, people began to change. She was good at the work. She knew which herbs could treat a fever, which cuts of meat would last through winter, which tools were worth the investment. She listened when people talked, remembered their names, asked about their families. And bit by bit the walls came down. The blacksmith's wife started bringing her fresh bread. The schoolteacher asked for her advice on treating a sick horse. Even some of the men who had once muttered insults now tipped their hats when she passed. One autumn afternoon, a young man came into the store. He was maybe a year or two older than Meadow, with dark hair and a shy smile. His name was Daniel, and he was new to the territory, a surveyor working on the railroad expansion. He needed supplies, basic things, but he took his time browsing, glancing at Meadow when he thought she was not looking. Can I help you find something? Meadow asked, amused. Daniel flushed. No, I mean yes. I need rope, good rope. The kind that will not snap under tension. Meadow led him to the right section, explaining the differences between hemp and manila, showing him how to test the strength. Daniel listened intently, asking questions, and by the time he left, he had spent twice as much as he planned and looked happier about it than he should have. He came back the next week, and the week after that, always with some excuse, some item he needed, some question about the area. Meadow was not foolish. She knew what he was doing, and she found, to her surprise, that she did not mind. One evening, as she was closing up the store, Daniel appeared in the doorway, hat in hand, looking nervous. Miss Meadow, I was wondering if you might like to take a walk with me sometime. Just around town, or maybe out to the creek, if you want. No pressure. Meadow studied him, this earnest young man who had no idea what he was getting himself into by courting the daughter of Toe Nighthawk. You know who my father is, right? Yes, Daniel said, swallowing hard. Everyone knows, and I will be honest, the thought of meeting him terrifies me. But I would like to get to know you better, if you will let me. Meadow smiled. Then you should come to dinner. Tomorrow night, at the cabin, and we will see if you survive meeting my papa. Daniel's face went pale, but he nodded. I will be there. The next evening, Daniel arrived at the cabin exactly on time, carrying a bottle of wine and a bouquet of wildflowers that he had clearly picked himself. He dismounted, tied his horse, and approached the porch where Toe sat, sharpening a knife with slow, deliberate strokes. The sound of the whetstone was ominous in the silence. Mr. Nighthawk, Daniel said, his voice only shaking a little. I am Daniel Pritchard. I came for dinner. Your daughter invited me. Toe looked up slowly, his dark eyes fixing on the young man with an intensity that could have melted steel. He did not speak. He just stared, letting the silence stretch until Daniel started to sweat. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Toe nodded toward the door. "Come in." Inside, Meadow was setting the table, and when she saw Daniel's terrified expression, she had to bite back a laugh. Dinner was tense at first, with Daniel answering Toe's questions in careful, measured tones. "Where are you from? What do you do? What are your intentions toward my daughter?" But as the evening wore on, Daniel relaxed slightly, and Toe, despite himself, found that he did not entirely hate the boy. He was respectful, hard-working, and clearly smitten with Meadow. That last part was both endearing and concerning. After dinner, Toe and Daniel stepped outside, while Meadow cleaned up. They stood in the clearing, looking up at the stars, and Toe spoke without looking at him. "She is the most important thing in my life. If you hurt her, there is no place on earth you can hide where I will not find you." Daniel swallowed hard. "I understand, sir, and I give you my word I will never hurt her. I will do everything I can to make her happy." Toe turned, finally looking at him directly. "Good, then we understand each other." Over the next year, Daniel became a regular presence in their lives. He courted Meadow properly, with Toe's grudging approval, taking her on walks, bringing her small gifts, making her laugh in ways that made Toe's heart ache with bittersweet pride. His little girl was growing up, finding her own path, and as much as it hurt to imagine her leaving someday, he knew it was inevitable. She was meant for more than just the mountain. She was meant for the world. The proposal came on a spring evening under the oak tree where Toe had carved their names so many years ago. Daniel asked Toe's permission first, as tradition demanded, and Toe, after a long, terrifying silence, gave it. The wedding was small, held in the clearing outside the cabin, with Catherine and Father Delgado and a handful of friends from town. Meadow wore a dress Catherine had sewn, simple and beautiful, with Navajo beadwork that Toe had added himself. And when Daniel took her hand and promised to love and protect her, Toe stood beside them, tears streaming down his face, because he was losing his daughter and gaining a son. And both truths hurt and healed in equal measure, but Meadow did not go far. She and Daniel built a house on the edge of the property, close enough that she could visit every day, far enough that they had their own space. And Toe, who had spent so many years alone, found himself surrounded by family again, by laughter and love, and the kind of noise that made a house feel like a home. 2 years later, Meadow gave birth to a daughter. She was small and perfect, with dark eyes and a shock of black hair. And when Meadow placed her in Toe's arms, he looked down at this tiny, fragile life and felt something break open inside him. Joy, pure, uncomplicated joy. "What will you name her?" Toe asked, his voice rough. Meadow smiled, tears in her eyes. "We were thinking June, after your daughter. If that is okay with you." Toe could not speak. He just held the baby. This second chance, this continuation of a legacy he thought had died, and nodded. And as little June wrapped her tiny hand around his finger, he knew that the circle was complete. He had been given a daughter who had saved him. And now that daughter had given him a grandchild who would carry their story forward. The years continued to roll by, marked by seasons and milestones and the quiet accumulation of a life well lived. Toe grew older, his hair going completely gray, his body slowing down, but his spirit remained strong. He taught June the same things he had taught Meadow, passing down the language, the songs, the stories. And when she asked him about his life, about the wars he had fought and the losses he had endured, he told her the truth. Not to burden her, but to show her that even the darkest nights eventually give way to dawn. On a late autumn afternoon, when Toe was in his 70s and June was 8, they sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the mountains. The air was crisp, smelling of pine and wood smoke, and the world was quiet except for the wind singing through the trees. "Grandfather?" June asked, her voice small and curious. "Were you always happy?" Toe thought about the question, about the years of pain and loneliness, the nights when he had wanted to disappear into the darkness and never come back. But then he thought about Meadow, about the moment she had looked up at him and asked him to be her papa. He thought about this cabin, this family, this life they had built together out of nothing but stubborn love. "No," he said honestly. "For a long time I was not happy. I was lost. But then your grandmother found me, and she gave me a reason to keep going. She taught me that family is not about blood. It is about choosing to love someone, even when it is hard. Especially when it is hard." June leaned against him, her small body warm and trusting. "I am glad she found you, grandfather." "So am I, little one," Toe said, wrapping his arm around her. "So am I." And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold, Toe Nighthawk sat surrounded by the family he had never thought he would have. In the home he had built with his own hands, and knew that every moment of pain, every year of loneliness, every scar he carried, had been worth it, because in the end, love had found him in the wilderness, and love had made him whole. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.